before Jesus performed a single miracle, before he gathered a single follower, before anything the world would remember him for had begun, he disappeared. 40 days into a wilderness, alone. No mission yet, no teaching, no movement, just silence, hunger, and something waiting for him in the dark. And what happened in those 40 days may be the most important part of the entire story. The part most people skip entirely. Here is the detail that almost nobody stops to examine. The moment before the wilderness is one of the most dramatic in the gospel record. Jesus is baptized in the Jordan River. The heavens open. A voice speaks. Something profound and unrepeatable occurs. And then, immediately after, he does not begin teaching. He does not call his disciples. He does not walk into the nearest town and announce what has happened. He turns away from all of that and walks into the wilderness. The Gospel of Mark uses a word that most translations soften significantly. The Spirit drove him there. Not led, not guided, drove. Why would the most profound moment of recognition in his life be immediately followed by the most extreme isolation? What was waiting for him there that could not be avoided? And why does the story insist on beginning not with power, but with emptiness? For centuries, most people have imagined the wilderness as a geography, sand and heat and silence. A desert somewhere east of the Jordan. A physical location you could mark on a map, yet few people notice how consistently the ancient world used physical places to describe interior realities. In the Hebrew tradition, the wilderness was never simply terrain. It was a threshold, a boundary between the life that was known and the life that had not yet been born. Mountains in Scripture are rarely just mountains. Rivers are rarely just rivers. Deserts are rarely just deserts. They are states, conditions, maps of something happening inside a human being. But this is where things become stranger. Because if the wilderness is not only a location, then the 40 days may not be only a duration. They may be a description of a process that has nothing to do with calendars, and everything to do with what it costs to become something new. Think about what the wilderness actually does to a person, not the romantic version, the real version. It removes everything that normally tells you who you are. No crowd to perform for, no role to inhabit, no applause, no status, no reflection of yourself in the eyes of others. No comfort to reach for when the silence becomes unbearable, no distraction to fill the space where identity used to be. Just you, and whatever is left when everything else has been stripped away. Who are you when there is nothing left to perform? That question is not comfortable. It is not supposed to be. Because the answer, for most people, is far more uncertain than they expected. And that uncertainty, that terrifying open space where identity used to stand, is precisely what the wilderness creates. It does not destroy you. It exposes you. An exposure, in the ancient understanding, was not a danger. It was the beginning of the work, yet few people notice the number itself and what it carries. 40 days in the wilderness, 40 years wandering in the desert. 40 days of rain before the flood recedes. 40 days before Moses receives the law. The number appears again and again across the ancient texts with a consistency that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. And ancient traditions rarely used numbers the way we use them today. They were not simply counting, they were describing. 40, in nearly every instance it appears, marks the same kind of event, a complete and painful transition, a period of dissolution before something new can form. A threshold between one life and another that cannot be rushed or shortened. Not because the number itself is magical, but because what it describes refuses to be hurried. What if 40 was never about days at all? What if it was about completeness, about the full weight of a transformation that has to run its entire course before it finishes? About the fact that certain things simply cannot be skipped, no matter how much a person wants to get to the other side. And then the temptations arrive. 3 of them, each one precise, each one targeting something specific. For centuries, these have been read primarily as external events. A supernatural adversary presenting literal offers. Turn these stones into bread. Throw yourself from this height. Take dominion over every kingdom in the world. But this is where things become stranger. Because when you look at what each temptation is actually targeting, something unexpected appears. None of them are targeting behavior. All 3 are targeting identity. The first temptation is the demand for immediate comfort. Turn stones to bread. Satisfy the hunger now. Use what you are to serve what you feel. The second is the demand for validation. Throw yourself down and be caught. Prove to yourself and to the watching world that you are who you believe yourself to be. The third is the demand for control. Take the kingdoms. Resolve the uncertainty of the wilderness by seizing dominion over everything outside yourself. Comfort, validation, control. 3 temptations. 3 directions in which a person can flee from the terrifying freedom of not yet knowing who they are. And the unsettling possibility is that these temptations did not only visit a man in a desert 2,000 years ago. Look at how most people actually live. Not the version they describe when asked. The version that runs beneath that. The relentless pursuit of comfort. The need to feel okay. To reduce friction. To smooth over every moment of discomfort before it can deepen into something meaningful. The equally relentless pursuit of validation. The need to be seen, approved of, reflected back as worthy, as successful, as someone whose life makes sense from the outside. And the pursuit of control. The ongoing project of arranging the external world tightly enough that uncertainty cannot get in. These are not ancient problems. They are the architecture of most modern lives. The desert changes. The temptations do not. They simply arrive wearing different clothes, a screen instead of a stone, a follower count instead of a kingdom, a carefully curated life instead of a mountaintop offer. But the mechanism is identical. And the question the wilderness story has always been asking, silently, across every century, is whether a person can resist all 3. Not once, not in a single dramatic moment of refusal, but consistently across an entire life, in the 10,000 small moments when comfort or approval or control present themselves as the reasonable choice. Because what is dying in the wilderness is not the body. What is dying is the false self. The constructed identity that was built from the outside in. The version of a person assembled from other people's expectations, inherited definitions of success, the accumulated weight of who they were told to be. Ancient traditions across every culture that touch this question describe transformation the same way. Not as growth added onto what already existed, but as the death of what was false, so that what was true could finally surface. The alchemists called it the nigredo, the blackening, the dissolution, the stage that comes before gold and cannot be bypassed. The shamanic traditions called it dismemberment, the process of being taken apart completely before being reassembled as something new. The mystics of every tradition called it the dark night, the period when all familiar sources of certainty go dark and a person is left in the silence with nothing to hold on to. The wilderness, in every tradition, precedes the mission, not coincidentally, causally. The wilderness was not standing in the way of who he was becoming. The wilderness was the way. Yet the modern world has built an entire civilization devoted to avoiding exactly this. Constant noise, constant stimulation, constant connection to something outside the self, so that the silence inside it never has to be faced directly. The average person today lives with less sustained silence than any human being in recorded history, and silence is precisely where the wilderness begins. Sit alone long enough, and the temptations arrive, not as dramatic supernatural offers, as thoughts, as impulses, as the quiet, persistent voice that says, "This uncertainty is unbearable. Reach for something, go back, return to what you know, become again what you were." The wilderness is the one place the ego cannot hide, which is exactly why everything in us tends to resist it, and which is also, perhaps, exactly why it matters so much. What if this story was never only about one man in one desert at one moment in history? What if it was always a map? A description of a process that runs through every human life that ever reaches for something genuine. The sudden clarity that precedes the wilderness. The moment something real is recognized, followed immediately by the drive into isolation, into uncertainty, into the confrontation with everything false. The temptations that arrive precisely when the old identity has become uncertain and the new one has not yet formed. The refusal that costs something. And then, on the other side of all of it, the mission, the clarity, the capacity to give something that could not have been given before the wilderness ran its full course. For centuries, people read the 40 days as a backstory, something that happened before the important part began. But what if the 40 days were the important part? What if everything that came after was only possible because of what was surrendered, confronted, and refused in the silence before anyone was watching? Everyone eventually finds themselves in a wilderness, a season where the certainties stop working, where the old identity no longer fits, where the answers that sustained an entire previous chapter of life suddenly feel hollow. Most people experience this as failure, as punishment, as evidence that something has gone deeply wrong. They reach immediately for the temptations, for comfort, for validation, for some way of regaining control and returning to the familiar. But what if the wilderness entering a person's life is not evidence of catastrophe? What if it is evidence of something trying to be born? What if the confusion and the silence and the collapse of the old identity are not obstacles to transformation, but the very substance of it? What if the secret hidden inside the 40 days was never about desert geography or ancient ritual, but about the unavoidable price of becoming something real? Perhaps that is why the story has survived for thousands of years, not as history, as recognition. Because something in every person who has ever read it has felt the wilderness from the inside. The stripping away, the silence, the temptations that arrive precisely when there is nothing left to hold on to. And maybe the real question was never why Jesus entered the wilderness. Maybe the real question is far more personal than that. If the wilderness came for you tomorrow, if everything that tells you who you are was suddenly removed, would you recognize it as a curse or as an invitation?